So I'd like to welcome you all to Sound Design Foundations Level 2. Basically, Massive, has been ubiquitous with electronic music and has been, some people still today consider it to be, the only thing that they really need to do music with. In the full-blown synthesis course, the 8-class thing that we did last year, there was a big focus on Serum, and Serum was one of the things. And, Serum basically, some can consider it kind of a spiritual successor to Massive. It allows you to create your own wavetables, which I think is one of the coolest things. And Massive doesn't, and Massive probably never will let you do it because they've now come out with a Massive X, which is a follow-up, but I find it to be not as good as the original one. Sometimes you don't need to change the original recipe. You just need to add a couple more things to it to spruce it up instead of redesigning the whole thing, because sometimes you make a mess out of it. But anyways, Massive is still one of my favorite tools. I use it all the time. It's so flexible and so versatile, and there's just so many different things that can be done with it. And it's just so unbelievably powerful. And it uses a variety of things that we've already seen, So the idea here with this is that with this course, it's successive based off of, yes, and everyone does use the Massive tables in Serum. However, Massive structure is different from Serum, and Massive allows you to do some things that you can't do inside Serum. And one of those main things that I will tell you about right now is, you remember this whole thing with the parallel filters, 2 filters running in tandem at the same time inside Silent that we looked at, where we had a low pass doing one thing and a band pass doing another. Serum only has one filter to do things in a normal serial mode. It has, you're going to say, oh, well, there's a second filter in the effects section. Well, yes, there is, but that only allows it to be chained in a serial connection. It does not allow for a parallel split signal out of it. So Serum is kind of like a single serial type connection for the filters, whereas Massive can do parallel. And Massive's modulation capabilities, in my opinion, I think go beyond what can be done inside Serum. Serum, I think, is very, very fast, and I think Serum sounds great, and I think that there's pluses and minuses to both of these. But at the end of the day, I think that there's a reason why Massive is so popular and why Massive has remained so relevant after all of these years. So I think the best place to start here with this is understanding how the interface is laid out. And this is, again, another one of these brilliant interfaces where there really aren't any drop-down menus and there isn't anything hidden for the most part. The main elements that you'd want to understand as far as the pitch for the oscillators, the volume level for the oscillators, the filter types, the filter cutoff positions, what's modulating what. This is all visible on the front panel. And again, this is, the brilliance of the design and everything, where again, it's not, these bigger structures and everything. Sometimes they have so many drop-down menus and so many different places that it's hard to glance and see what's going on with the structure at once. So basically the layout for Massive is that it contains 3 oscillators. And it contains 2 filters, and basically it contains 8 modulation sources. And the 8 modulation sources can consist of envelopes and LFOs, and a thing called performer, and a thing called steppers, which we're going to look at. There are audio effect processors inside Massive that can be positioned at different places related to the filter and the oscillators. And we have global effects as well. And we also have the ability to do a couple of other things, because there is a 4th oscillator inside Massive that does not produce sound. This 4th oscillator is for the sake of doing modulation and doing audio rate modulation. And whenever we get into the topic of doing audio rate modulation, we get into some very exciting things. This is where, things start to get really, really exciting. So the layout for Massive is that it's going to follow along very similarly to a subtractive synthesis method. So basically, we're going to deal with making harsh sounds that we use filters, series of filters, or parallel filters, to subtract some of that harshness and everything and create these evocative, metallic-y type sounds. So I think the best place to start looking is at the oscillator level. And the way that the oscillator works is that I have a drop-down menu of wavetables. And the wavetables are categorized into basic, analog, digital hybrid, and effects and chords. And then I have VA, which is virtual analog. And we'll deal with that in a moment. That basically is going to allow us to simulate some of the things with the subtractive synthesizer that we cannot do with fixed wavetables. So we're just going to leave things alone on this first square saw. And why is it called square saw? Well, the way that a wavetable works is that, like I said, it's a series of waveforms that are on a table that we then use a dial to sweep through the different waves. And if I go all the way over here on the left and I strike the key, we're going to hear a square wave. And as I move the wavetable position over to the right-hand side, it's going to morph it into a square wave. I'm sorry, a sawtooth wave. And I think one of the cool things to take a look at with this would be the spectrum analyzer. So let's go to EQ8 and let's add one to the track. And now we can see this, that it basically will go from the odd harmonics to all of the harmonics. Basically, what we're dealing with here is we're dealing with an oscillator that's going to allow me to blend between different waveforms. As you hear, it goes smoothly from one position to the other. It doesn't do abrupt changes like a fixed wavetable. It's actually smoothly cross-fading between the different spectra on the table. And there are a variety of different waveforms to choose, wavetables to choose from. So in the basic areas where we have what we would, deal with as far as a subtractive synthesizer. And these waveforms, like I said, that what we saw inside Silent, these are waveforms that we're going to be using over and over and over again. So the square wave, the sawtooth wave, the sine wave, the triangle wave, these are fundamental waveforms that are going to be necessary for making sounds. These are not things that are like, okay, well, I was in analog subtractive synthesizer land and I'm never going to use these waveforms again. No, these are fundamental basic waveforms that are used, and we'll use them in combination with the wavetable waveforms. So the fourth envelope is hardwired to control the volume or the amplifier. So basically this is where we would want to shape our sounds. So the idea here with this is that if I put this to the sawtooth wave and I want to do something that's going to be like a pad sound, this is where I would make my adjustments. Now, the thing I will mention with this is that Massive has incredibly fast envelopes. And what that means is that it can create very, very punchy, very tight sounds. And this is something that's generally very desirable for doing bass sounds and lead sounds. So in order to really coax out these long drawn out swells on, volume or filter changes or whatever, we need to use longer values for the attack. So just like in dealing with a subtractive synthesizer, we could go ahead and incorporate a second oscillator into the mixture. And the second, each oscillator has its own independent amplifier control. And this is going to allow for a very, very cool level of things to go on here, because we haven't seen, we have independent volume control for each one of the oscillators. So each one could be coming in at different points in time in the sound. So if I go here and set this to a sawtooth wave, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to detune things similar into the way that we dealt with the subtractive analog synthesizer. Maybe make the first one -11, the second one 11.11, I'm sorry. And then basically we have a detuned sound. So continuing on with this, let's take what we know from the subtractive world and let's say, okay, we want to make a sub-oscillator here now with the whole thing. So we would use the third oscillator in order to create a square wave that's an octave lower. And here's a little trick in using Massive. If I hold down the Option key on my computer keyboard, it allows me to throw the pitch by octaves. So it doesn't require me to go through the single individual one. So let's go ahead here and make this -12, and let's turn the volume up on the third oscillator. And now I've got a 3 oscillator pad sound. So very, very similar to what we were able to do inside Silent and that type of thing. So like I said, a lot of these things are not, not necessarily going away. They're here. They're just things that we're going to look at in different contexts and everything. So let's take a look now over into the filter area with all of this. So basically, we have more filter options than what were available inside Silent. So we have the standard fare as far as low pass filters, band pass, and high pass. So basically, there are two variants on the low pass. We have the low pass 4 and the low pass 2. And the low pass 4 is going to be a 24 decibel filter. And the low pass 2 is going to be a 12 decibel. I have a high pass 4, which is going to be a 24 decibel high pass, and a high pass 2, which is going to be a 12 decibel high pass. I also have the band pass filter here, and I also have, the high pass, band pass, and low pass is pretty much what we're going to be dealing with for the most part, but we have some additional ones like the notch, we have band reject, we have some stylized ones like the Doft filter, comb, and acid, and we'll be looking at all this stuff as we go forward with all of this. But for the most part right now, what I want to do is I want to create this pad sound that's utilizing a low pass filter, and I want the sound to go from a dark to a bright over time. So, and you see that what I'm doing here is I'm, even the same way that I was talking about doing things with the subtractive synthesizer, I'm talking about doing it here with the wavetable synthesizer. So I'm thinking about it in the same kind of context as far as when I go to program the sound. So what I want to have happen is, and the way that this is working right now is that the filter is in a parallel mode. I'm going to set it to a serial mode, and I'm going to turn off the second filter. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have it so that the mix of the filters only comes from filter 1 here. And what I want to do now is I want to make it so that it goes from a dark to a bright sound over time. And the way that I'm going to do this is that each of these little squares here in Massive allows for me to plug in a modulation source into the whole thing. So I can either right-click to add the modulation source, or I can simply drag the 4-directional arrow with the X marks the spot, I guess, is what I would consider that. It's like an onk almost, where it's like an anchor. So basically, let's take envelope 3, and let's drag this over here to filter cutoff. And if I click here on the box and I push up, it allows me to set the modulation in a positive direction, or pull down the other direction allows me to set it into a negative direction. To me, this is one of the most brilliant things that we see here on the interface, the fact that we can see how much modulation is applied. And the question that you might ask is, how much does this move when I apply that? Well, this is the exact range that it's going through. So we can, hear it beforehand and everything to see what it's doing. So we don't have the ability to, let's see, I don't think that we have the ability to, okay, we can do copy here, and then we can go to envelope 3, and what we can do is say paste. So we do have the ability to copy and paste the same way that we can inside Silent. So let's go ahead and put a longer attack on this so the sound stays darker for a little bit. And maybe what we want it to do is we want it to come back down again as far as the brightness once it reaches its apex and everything, and maybe get a little bit darker again then. So let's strike the keys here, and I'm also going to turn my release time up slightly on that. Okay, so some things to be aware of that, might be immediate things as for some of the tricks that I was doing with Silent that you don't see going on here. One of the things to be aware of is that Massive does not have a unison mode per oscillator, the same way that we were able to do this with Silent. This is actually one of the things that Serum allows you to do that, is an expansion upon the wavetable synthesis idea. But we can put massive into a unison mode. And the way that we do this is by going to voicing here. And in voicing, we set it to what the max number of unison voices is, and we set it to the polyphony then as far as what we want it to be. So what this means is that if I set this to 18, I can hold down 6 keys at the same time, and each one remains at 3-voice unison. And you might say, why are you using a 3-voice unison with this? And the reason is because in addition to being able to control the detuning, which is controlled from the pitch cutoff here, if I go ahead and set the pitch cutoff, let's actually set this to 5 voices so that we can detune this now. So if I strike the keys and hold down a chord, so it creates that detuned sound, but that's not really what I'm going for here with this. What I want to do is I want to make the sound bigger and wider is what I want to do. So instead of utilizing the detune control here, I'm going to utilize the pan position control. And what this is going to do is because I chose 3 voices, what it's going to do is it's going to keep 1 center, 1 left, and 1 right when I strike the keys. So immediately right off the bat, and I hope that Listen To is working. Everybody is hearing the wide stereo imaging with this. Makes a huge difference from where it had been. If I turn this off to listen to it, so we're still getting to a similar place as far as what we were able to do with the subtractive analog synthesizer, but we're doing it in a different way. So again, there's going to be things that I'm showing you here along the way that, you might be questioning, well, how did we get, we were able to do it in that thing? How are we able to do it here? So these are some of the important things that we're going to be revisiting and using all the time for these sounds as far as using unison and using the panning position all along the way. So it's important to know where this is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead here and I'm going to make a new sound. And with this next sound, what I want to do is I want to create a square bass sound, similar to the way that I did with Silent. And, you might be saying, well, why are you showing us the same types of sounds that you were able to do with the subtractive analog synthesizer? And the reason is because it doesn't make a difference what the synthesizer is that you're using. If you know how to use it, you can use it to make any type of sound that you want. And once we start, and remember what I told you here, the idea with this is that I design sounds, I get something that I think sounds good in one particular state, then I start plugging in different variables into the whole thing. And then once we get into the wavetable stuff here with what the Wavetable Oscillator is capable of doing, we're really able to get some really magical things happening once we start plugging in different variables. So let's go back to this idea of the square wave, okay? So what I want to do is I want to create this punchy square wave bass type sound, okay? And the idea with this is that I'm going to utilize a low-pass filter. So let's go to the low-pass 4, which is the 24 decibel filter, as opposed to the 12. And what I want to do is I want to go ahead here and take envelope 3 and drop it here as a modulation source. And I'm going to go ahead and increase the amount. And I'm going to pull my sustain level down and pull my decay time back. And it's interesting because when you pull the decay time back, it looks like it's increasing it, right? Because it's going in what looks like the wrong direction. You would think that this would be pinching further over to the left, and that's just a weird interface design thing that they have going on here. Let's go ahead and change the octave range with this also, or maybe what we'll do is we'll go ahead and add a version of this an octave lower. So let's go to the square wave now, and let's strike this. Let's change this one an octave lower. Okay, so the sound is getting there, but what I might want to do here is I might want to, there's a couple of things, and I don't know if you remember this from the subtractive synthesis class, but one of the important things that I showed you when we're making bass sounds or making these sounds where we want to have them hit consistently the same way each time is that we use an oscillator phase reset, where basically it starts at the same position on the waveform each time instead of happening at a random point. So if I go here to the Oscillator tab, it allows me to restart the phases of the waveforms by gate. And what that means is by gate, it means by one single trigger that's all going to start at the same position. So we can actually offset what the positions are for the waveforms, but I'm going to leave everything starting at the very, very beginning of this. And this is where we also have our portamento or glide. And I can set this here how I want it to be. And I'm going to go back to my voices here, and I'm also going to go ahead and I'm going to set this to 3 voices, but instead of using the wide version of this now, I'm going to go ahead and set this to monophonic so that it's only one note at a time. And I'm not detuning anything, and I'm not going to play with the panning position at all either. And, you know, this was another idea for the Unison. We don't necessarily need to detune things. We can use the Unison to thicken sounds up and make them more full. And let me go ahead here and set my slide time a little bit different. Now remember what I told you, that expression control is very, very key with programming synthesizers, and this actually holds even more so true with wavetable synthesis. So one of the things, you know, one of the oldest tricks in the book here, one of the more common things that I would do is I would want to make the sound so that it's reactive to how hard or how soft I strike on the key, meaning that it's going to be brighter, it's going to be duller, depending on how soft or how hard I strike. So over at the bottom here is where my expression controls live. So this is velocity, this is aftertouch, this is keyboard tracking, and this is, I forget what that is. Let's see what it is. It is here in key groups, trigger, random. So what I want to do here is I can do this in 2 ways, okay? So like I said, there's multiple modulation sources for a particular parameter. So if I right-click here and I go to key groups, I can select velocity, and then I can increase this so that the velocity makes it more reactive to how hard or how soft I strike. So I'm going to go ahead here and pull this down a little bit so that the sound is duller and darker. So already we've got a very expressive sound going on here. So part of the idea with Wavetable is that what we'll do here is we'll then take this great idea for a sound here and we'll start expanding upon it. So I've just done, you know, 2 oscillators here, one that's doing a traditional square wave, the other one that's doing a traditional square but an octave lower to simulate this sub-oscillator type of scenario, which we saw in many of the classic Roland synthesizers, but is also one of these tricks for programming so that we create these wider sounds that, you know, have, you know, the sound happening over multiple frequency ranges through the use of octaves. So what I'm going to do now is that the idea with Wavetable is basically getting something solid, but then lacing it with what Wavetable does great, which is these digital elements and everything. So in BASIC, we have different types of waveforms, wavetables that exist. So, you know, we have the traditional analog fair and variations on it. We also have additive type waveforms as well, which is going to create these bell-like type sounds. So I'm going to go here to the additive. Let's try additive octaves first with this. And the idea with this is that I can turn off the different oscillators from these little buttons here. And it's important to basically be able to hear things clearly with this. I can also turn off the filter completely as well. And that way I can hear just what the waveform and wavetable sounds like. And let's go ahead here and change this. So you see these little arrows right here. This will allow me to advance through the wavetable as well. And maybe change the octave range here so that this is an octave higher than the other parts. Okay, so let's hear how this sounds now laced against everything else. And you hear how that sounds very, very cool as far as me changing the wavetable position as I'm going along here with this. So what I might want to do here is I might want to make it so that the wavetable position, and this is another big trick of wavetable synthesis, making the wavetable position expressive by way of velocity. So make it so that as I hit harder, I hit softer, the wavetable position changes so that I get a different sound each time I strike the keys. Now, one of the catches here with this that we should be aware of is that we don't have the ability to independently control the oscillator phase restart for each oscillator. So basically, it's going to do it globally for the entire thing. So, you know, we have to be judicious with this as far as what type of a sound we're actually going for and what we're trying to create. So basically with this, the idea is that, you know, I'd come up with something solid and incorporate it with the wavetable aspect of things. Let's go through some other wavetables here as, you know, I'm just going to cycle through this as I play back to find something that maybe might be better than what's going on here. So it moves through different categories. So there's a category of analog electric and then the category of digital hybrid to follow this. And the idea with this is that as I move through the categories, the sounds become more metallic and more synthetic and more you know, more exotic sounding as far as the wavetables go. So why don't we just jump over here to something that sounds more exotic than the others? Let's go to gentle speech. And there's your little pluck at the beginning of the whole thing, a little plink sound. So these details are very, very key to the entire thing of making wavetable sounds. So let's go ahead here and let's start fresh now, okay? So actually, let's go to, let's see, we'll just go here to untitled sound and we'll go to, we'll keep this one. So we're just going to duplicate it and make a new one, then go here to this. And what we're going to do is go back into Massive's interface. And inside this, what I'm going to do is say new sound. Okay, so, you know, we don't always necessarily want to start from the idea of doing this with the subtractive analog oscillator. This might be something that we add as an afterthought to all of this. So, you know, we might want to pick a wavetable to begin with all of this. So let's go ahead here and let's jump to this vulgar wavetable. And this is a, you know, definitely one that would be used for more modern style music and everything. We hear it, it's got kind of that growl to it and everything. And, you know, there are a ton of different modulation options that I can add into this whole thing. So let's go ahead here and let's take a envelope and let's go ahead and make it so that it goes from a dark to a bright in kind of a growl. Okay, so The idea with this is that it's, it's definitely, it's not a waveform that we would hear with, a subtractive synthesizer and everything. So, I had told you, when we looked at the subtractive analog synthesizer, that effect processing is very, very key to finishing the sound and to doing things with it. So this actually holds even more true when we're dealing with digital systems like wavetable synthesis. And the only thing better than a wavetable oscillator and a wavetable is a distorted wavetable. And we can create some very, very interesting things out of the distortion capabilities that exist with Wavetable. So if I go here to routing, this might be one of the scarier pages if you've used Massive before and you don't know what it looks like. It can look like a schematics chart and everything, and it actually is. It shows the signal flow inside Massive and allows me to do a couple of things. I have multiple inserts here, and the inserts that are available are different distortion types that are useful for dealing with wavetables. So it's not the traditional, analog type distortion like the Tube Screamer or the Proco Rat or the things that we saw that were similar to like the Clip Fold and Overdrive that existed inside Silent. They're more specialized towards different types of wave shapers and things like that that are going to be much more beneficial with dealing with wavetables. So the way that the structure works here, and we'll be coming back to this, is that we can choose the order of where the effects are going to be placed. So the insert effect 1 can be moved before filter 1 or after filter 1. It can be moved to the end chain of the combination of filter 1 and filter 2. It can be placed just at filter 2. And, so we have flexibility here. I'm going to leave it at the end of filter 1 here. And we're not even going to use filter 1 to do anything yet. We're just going to have everything coming out, the way that it is out of the system by itself, so we can hear what the different types of distortion are doing to this. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to go to Insert 1, and I'm going to go to the distortions that we're going to be dealing with. You see, the last 3 here are really the main distortions that we're going to be dealing with. So we have Sine Shaper, Parabolic Shaper, and Hard Clipper. So if I go to Sine Shaper, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pull my drive down. I'm going to pull the wet dry amount up. And just for the sake of listening here, let's go ahead and set this to 3-voice unison, set it to monophonic, and set the pan position wide on this so that we're getting a nice big full sound out of it to deal with the finer details here. So as you hear, the distortion makes a huge difference with the wavetable here. And you might say, why is it making such a huge difference here? It's because these wavetables have a level of resonant tone in them. And whenever the resonant tone is mixed with a distortion, it starts to create these wild, magical things that start to happen. So a little known fact, and something that not everybody pays attention to, is the fact that these insert effects are all modulatable by modulation sources. So with the drive control here, I can utilize velocity here to now go and control the drive amount so that I make it so that it hits with more distortion as I hit harder and hit softer. So I'm right off the bat, without utilizing any filters or anything, I'm able to make these expressive type sounds out of utilizing the expression controls and the modulation sources, just with the things that are really kind of inherent to the wavetable itself. Let's go ahead now and swap this out for a different distortion. Let's try the parabolic shaper and see what this does. And the hard clipper. Now, the cool thing with this is that if we take a look at the routing here, we can actually double up these distortions and piggyback them on top of each other. And this is where things start to get really kind of crazy with the sound and creates these big, heavy type, wavetable sounds that Massive is known for as far as doing these modern type sounds. So One of the things with Massive that it's known for is that it's very easy to get the sound very dirty and get it very, aggressive sounding and fuller. And that's why it's been very popular for dubstep and some of the harder electro sounds. But again, it's a fully blown wavetable synthesizer. It's capable of producing all different types of sounds. It's just that certain sounds are easier to achieve inside certain structures. And this is a case in point where it's definitely easier to achieve certain types of sounds with Massive. So I've gone ahead here now and I've taken insert 2 and I've placed it so that it happens down the chain after insert 1. And I'm going to go ahead here now and I'm going to choose, let's choose a parabolic shaper to follow this through with. And let's turn the wet dry amount up and let's hear what this does. So just like that, I've made a very, very heavy abrasive type sound with, not even using filters, not even using any of the things that you might expect from, the synthesis engine and all of this. Now, again, I can elaborate on this idea as far as what I might want to do to create tonal variation. So the wavetable position is being moved by envelope 3. Maybe I want to go ahead here and add velocity into the mixture as well, or I want more of the envelope to be applied by increasing the velocity. So I can actually make the envelope velocity sensitive. In the modulators, we have a tremendous amount of options and features and functions that we can do. Velocity is actually hardwired to the modulators. So I can go ahead here and apply velocity directly through, so I don't need to use it up for a slot here to control the attack time or different things like that. So as I strike softer on the keys, less of the envelope is going to be applied. As I strike harder, and maybe what I want to do is I want to go ahead here and do this velocity trick again with the parabolic shaper as well. And let's apply a mount here. So this is just one single oscillator that's going here, one single wavetable oscillator. Now, one of the key points with this is that the wavetable oscillators can get very brittly sounding and very thin. And again, the same trick that we looked at here with the subtractive analog synthesizer, where we were using sine waves or what we know as anchor waveforms to create the tonal center and keep the center of everything going. So I'm going to go ahead here and I'm going to turn on oscillator 2 and I'm going to choose a sine square or sine triangle. It doesn't really matter which one I use. And I'm going to move this all the way to the sine, and I'm going to take it and throw it an octave lower than the wavetable oscillator. Okay, but that's actually creating a bit of a problem here now, isn't it? We may not have necessarily wanted to distort the sine wave. And this is where things get really, really interesting with the routing inside Massive, okay? So remember, I have 2 filters here, and I can choose whether I hear a mix between filter 1 and filter 2. I can run them into series or to parallel mode. I'm going to flip them to parallel mode by moving them down this way. I'm then going to go ahead and set everything so it's a 50-50 mix out of the 2. Now here's the scenario and the situation. I want to distort this wavetable oscillator, but I want the sine wave to remain pure. I don't want it to be distorted. So how do I do this? Well, the way that I do it is that you'll see that on the output of each of the oscillators, it has a directional place where it goes to either filter 1 or filter 2. I'm going to send oscillator 1 to filter 1, and I'm going to send oscillator 2 to filter 2. I'm then going to go into my routing scenario right here, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to position insert 1 before, and I'm going to position insert 2 after filter 1. But I'm not using filter 1 for anything. It's just, there's no sound going through it whatsoever. And then sine wave on oscillator 2 is just going to pass through filter 2, which doesn't have any effect processing going on anywhere in the chain. So if I strike the key now, we should hear a clean sine wave. And we don't hear anything because the volume is all the way down on filter 2. Okay, so we hear a nice pure sine wave. And now, if I incorporate oscillator 1 back into the mixture, we're listening to the mix out of filter 2. So as you can see, the routing is very, very flexible inside Massive. And, we can now, do some very interesting, tricky things here with this. So one of the interesting, tricky things is that we might actually utilize a filter here onto just the wavetable portion of the whole signal here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to utilize a bandpass filter here. And what I want to do is I want to make it so that the distorted wavetable portion of this is being modulated by the filter and the sine wave is being left alone. So how do I want that to move? Well, I could definitely utilize an envelope to do this. And go ahead here and turn my attack time up. So that's one way to do it, but a more interesting way might be to actually use a cyclic control signal. And the cyclic control signals that we know are LFOs. And this is what we looked at from Silent. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take LFO 5 or modulator 5, LFO 1, and drop it here. And the LFOs are very, very sophisticated inside Massive. Believe it or not, they're actually more sophisticated than the Massive X LFOs are. And one of the things that you'll probably notice with this is that you'll say, that's interesting. I see two waveforms. I see a sine wave and I see a sawtooth wave. Why is that? Well, that's because we can utilize multiple waveforms per LFO. So they can either work simultaneously together, modulating the signal, or they can work independently of each other and hear one or the other. So we have this crossfade curve that's going to allow us to dictate which modulation signal is being fed into the destination. So if I play this back, I'm going to go ahead and pull the position up a little bit, and I'm just going to find the correct spot for this as far as where I want it to be. So you can already hear with very minimal effort and everything, dubstep and electro and these modern EDM styles are very, very, Massive is kind of like, synonymous with these styles of music and everything and really allows for very, very fast programming of these types of sounds. An additional control that I have is the bandwidth for the bandpass filter. And what this is going to control is how wide that actual signal is in the center as far as what's, where the high pass and the low pass cut everything out. So on the LFO, I want to draw your attention to some of these boxes here and everything. So there are multiple types of boxes that are here. And there's boxes to control the rate, there's boxes to control the crossfade curve, and there's boxes to control the amount of the LFO. So basically the LFO amount, in addition to being controlled up here, can also be controlled on the LFO itself. And you might say, well, why would I want to have it controlled in both places? And the reason is because you might want to do a delayed attack on that LFO amount. So the way that we would do this is that each LFO actually has its own dedicated internal envelope that controls attack and decay. So if I go here and I drag this internal envelope to a mount, I'm going to go ahead here and just like in the modulation of everything else, and I know people who've worked with Massive for years in all of this and have never seen these little details with it because these are just some of the things that, are just kind of buried away in the system and everything. So if I go here now and I put a longer attack on this, what's going to happen is that it's not going to start doing the wobbling immediately with the sound. So it takes a little bit of time. So we have an internal envelope. One of the other very, very cool things with the way that the LFOs work inside Massive is that we might want to change where the offset is for the control signal. So we might not necessarily want the sine wave starting at the very beginning here. And this is, again, one of these brilliant, brilliant, brilliant designs that's in here. It's the fact that I have directional arrows that allow me to move the starting position of where this might be. And again, what I can do is I can do this with both waveforms, and maybe I want to do some sort of a combination of the two. And let's not forget this trick that I showed you with the keyboard tracking in the Silent class, but basically keyboard tracking, which is another expression control, can be dragged here to the rate. And this is a very cool one because what this is going to do is it's going to make for slower LFO rates as I play lower on the keyboard and faster ones as I play higher. Make sense? Yes, I think so. Okay, so, and again, we're this level with this course and everything, we're going to be looking at all of this stuff. Again, this is just kind of like the intro here today as far as understanding what we've seen already and looking at some of the expanded capabilities as far as how we deal with this with Wavetable. I want to draw your attention to one more type of distortion here that we're going to be using quite a bit when we're dealing with Massive. And this is a very, very powerful one to be using. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to duplicate this track again, and I'm going to go here and pull up a new sound and start fresh. Now, remember I told you that there were 4 oscillators inside Massive. 3 that produce sound and 1 that works as a modulation oscillator. And the modulation oscillator allows us to do audio rate modulation. And the audio rate modulation allows us to do FM synthesis. I know, it doesn't say anywhere FM synthesis. It's because FM synthesis has I guess you could call it a twin or a functionality where it's done the same, it's the same thing that achieves the end results. Believe it or not, the Yamaha DX7, which was the first commercially available FM synthesis keyboard synthesizer in the 1980s, did not use FM synthesis. It used phase modulation synthesis. And phase modulation synthesis was essentially the same type of thing. It just produced more stable pitch elements when the keys were played up the keyboard and everything. So just a little known fact for all of this, they used FM branding because of the hype of FM radio at the time. Yes, that's correct. But we still call it FM synthesis. So inside Massive, so the way that this works is that let's go here to a very, very basic waveform. Let's go to a sine wave, okay, so that we hear everything completely pure and clean. And let's see, I'm just going to turn the volume up a little bit higher on this. And the modulation oscillator can be engaged by turning the light on it. And then the phase control here, which is the first one we're going to be looking at, we'll be looking at the others as we go forward with all of this, but the phase modulation is audio rate modulation, and this allows us to perform FM, or audio rate modulation, to any said given oscillator. It can only do one at a time, so we have a destination for where we point it to. So I'm going to point it to 1, and this is our amount control here. It's called phase. So as I strike the key, it's going to FM the sine wave. And I can change the octave range of the modulation oscillator as well. Now, traditionally, the way that FM synthesis and phase modulation synthesis works is that we're dealing with banks of sine waves, which produce very, very controlled, very clean type sounds. However, the purpose for having this modulation oscillator in here is not to do this with clean sine waves. This is to do this with wavetables, because again, this is another distortion type method that we can utilize. And yes, sometimes other waveforms are often too complex and create a messy sound, but the way that Massive is designed and the structure with it is that it's actually very friendly for dealing with these more complex waveforms. So let's go back to this vulgar waveform that I had picked here before when I was showing you with the other sound example. And let's put it in a fixed position here like this. I'm going to go ahead and just make things a little bit more beautiful for us to listen to by utilizing the wide panning range and everything. Now, if we incorporate FM synthesis or phase modulation at this moment in time onto this particular type of waveform, we start to get these wild, exotic results. And we're going to keep this true to the way that FM synthesis worked, is the fact that, you know, it was designed around performance-based controls, because at the time when it came out, it was a performer's keyboard. You know, it was before it had, you know, it was one of the first commercially available ones to have MIDI capabilities with it, but this predates, you know, getting a MIDI keyboard and saying, okay, I'm going to take it home and connect it up to my Commodore 64 or my Atari ST and have MIDI working immediately. This was in the early days of things. So basically these things didn't, you know, exist at the time when it came out, but the expression controls in all of this were there. And this was a very important thing. So we're going to hold true with this and put velocity as a control here for the phase modulation amount. And if I do this all the way across the board, the sound is going to become incredibly expressive by having the phase modulation or the FM amount change as I strike harder and softer. And let's go ahead and drop this an octave lower. So you get these very breathable type sounds where it's very expressive to how hard or how soft I strike on the keys. And when we start incorporating, you know, multiple types of things going on at the same time, this is where we really start to get these magical wavetable type sounds. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to have the wavetable position controlled by the modulation amount of velocity, as well as the modulation oscillator doing FM. Let's go ahead here and make this a Unison Detune sound. Let's set this up to maybe 5 voices and set this to, yeah. Now, what happens if we start incorporating these distortions into the mixture as well? Remember what I told you, that it's not, you know, one distortion is great and everything, but when we start piggybacking these things together is when we start to create these really magical things. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to set insert 1 to sine shaper, and I'm going to pull the wet dry amount back down. I'm going to introduce it as I'm holding down the sound, the key. So these incredibly aggressive and abrasive sounds can be created with massive, and it really requires very little amounts of work. But the devil is really in the details here with all this, because we want to make the sound not a static picture. We want to make it so that it's something moving, something that it's alive. The real magic with these sounds comes if you've, gotten your hands on some of the good presets, or some of the, even on a hardware synthesizer or something else like this. The magic comes to life when you start, experimenting with some of these, really well-crafted presets that, are very reactive to how you play and, and what you do to it. So I'm going to go ahead and set this to velocity control. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set another wave shaper. We're going to use parabolic as well. And let's go to the routing here and let's make sure that it's plugged into the output here, because it was only going to filter 2. I'm going to go here and set my velocity again to be controlled here like this. So as you hear, just with some distortion onto the wavetable, I've gone ahead and created a totally usable sound for different styles of music and everything. And I've only utilized one oscillator here. I haven't even utilized any of the filters or anything like that either. So I'm going to go ahead, and what I want to do is I just want to go ahead and make an anchor here with all of this. So again, I'm going to do this trick where I have the distortion going on for the Wavetable Oscillator, and only the Wavetable Oscillator. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set this to a sine triangle waveform for Oscillator 2, and I'm going to turn it on, and I might set it to an octave lower than the first one. That way I have it at lower pitch. And maybe what we'll do is we'll utilize a filter. So this time, instead of the low pass or the band pass filter, I'm going to use this filter called DOFT. And this is basically an analog modeled filter that they have in here. And it's basically designed to be a 24 decibel, warmer analog style sounding filter. Okay, so just that movement that I've done right here with moving the actual filter cutoff, I want to go ahead and make it so that the envelope is controlling this over time. So what it's doing is it's going from a dark to a bright back down to a dark. So, and it's doing it rather quickly. So I think we can get this to happen here like that. So with minimal amounts of effort here, I've gone and created a really exotic, unique sounding kind of sound here out of Wavetable, and just a simple sine wave. So I think the last thing that I want to draw your attention to here today, and we're going to be going, the idea here with this is to kind of get our feet wet in how all of this works in this first class and everything, and kind of look at some of the similarities and kind of get an idea for how Wavetable produces these different sounds. Don't worry, there's a lot more details that we're going to be going through as we work with this. But one of the things that I want to show you here with this is the idea of utilizing effect processors. And, you might say, well, I might want to process on the outside of Massive and everything and do that. But the thing I want to draw your attention to is that the effect processors are also controlled by modulation sources inside Massive. So this allows us to do some unique things with sound that we wouldn't otherwise be able to do. So there are two final effects, and there is an EQ. So basically, if I go here to the insert effects one, let's take a look at what we have. So we have a reverb, a small reverb, a flanger positive mono, flanger negative mono, chorus mono, chorus ensemble, phaser mono, delay synced, dimensional expander, classic tube, teletube, and Bronner tube. More distortions? Okay, well, maybe we'll experiment with one of the more distortions. So let's go here to classic tube. And basically this is just going to give us a little bit more of a warmer bite on the end of the whole thing. Maybe what I'm going to do is take my modulation oscillator and set it to -12 instead of -24. Very rubbery type sound that we've created here with this. So the distortion and the tube and everything, so let's go ahead and let's make it so that as I strike harder on the key, the drive is more intense with all of this. So again, I'm going to go to the velocity here, and this is the great thing about piggybacking these modulation sources and these expression controls. You know, so setting it to just one thing inside the synthesizer engine is kind of limiting yourself with all of this. It's great when it's affecting multiple things at the same time so that the sound changes and the sound is never really, you know, one of the things that I, you know, try to go at with this is that I really don't want to make the sound, you know, repeating the same way every single time. I want it to have some life and want it to sound a little bit different each time. So, you know, utilizing these subtle controls like velocity or keyboard tracking or different things like this are really going to, you know, enhance the sound and bring it to life and just make it a bit more organic and make it more natural sounding. And let's go ahead and hear this with the other tube type distortions. So what we can hear is that it's, again, increasing the amount of distortion as we choose further along tube type and everything. So basically, the classic tube is what I'm going to leave it on. And generally, the way that I program these types of sounds is that, you know, I'm going to leave FX2 to be a type of spatial effect. So this can either be the, a reverb or a delay as far as what it's going to be. So there's actually a very, very unique type of reverb that's based inside Massive. And this is one of the signature effects that basically, it's interesting because the owner's manual doesn't explain what it is. And Danny and I used to work, you know, at a place a long time ago. And this was a big topic of discussion as far as what is the dimensional expander doing? What exactly does it do to the signal? Why is it doing that? Why does it sound so good? How would I create an effect like that? And it's a lot easier than you think it is. What it is basically an algorithmic reverb consists of two parts. The early reflections part, which is basically the amount of time it takes from the first reflection off of the surface for the sound. And the second portion is the diffusion network. The diffusion network is how the sound bounces around inside the space and everything and creates multiple regenerations and reflections. And, you know, they're very small, so it's not like a delay, you know, it's much tighter and everything. And this is generally the basis for how an algorithmic reverb works, something that's not a convolution reverb. And what the dimensional expander is the dimensional expander is just the early reflections portion of a reverb. So what it does is it creates this almost like three-dimensional type of thing where it sounds like the sound is coming off of the flat paper that it's on. So if I go here and I turn the wet dry amount down, so it does that little bit to it to just make it that much better, puts it, you know, so that it doesn't sound completely flat against the paper. And this is a very, very useful element that we're going to be using all the time. Let's say we want it to, you know, go into a bigger size as we play higher on the keyboard and everything. Again, we can utilize the keyboard tracking here to control this. So let's go ahead and turn this up further. So very, very, very powerful sounds. And again, the beauty with this whole thing is that everything is right here visible on the front panel of the thing. I don't need to jump into endless menus and go from one page to another. The only thing I have to switch between is the envelopes and the LFO pages for the most part. But the beautiful part with this that I will say is that you can see it directly on the interface, what's controlling what. So it's not a mystery as far as jumping to say, oh, is LFO, is envelope 3 what's controlling the filter cutoff, or is it envelope 2, or is it envelope 1? I can't remember. They're all blue. No, it actually shows you the number and everything that you're seeing here with all of this. So I think that this is a good stopping point for today here. Again, the point with this and the purpose was to really kind of get our feet wet into understanding what we're going to be able to achieve with wavetable synthesis. Like I said, there's so many more finer points and details with all of this. We're going to be looking stylistically at creating particular types of sounds. As you saw here, today, the example with this, and, again, what I wanted to show you was really kind of drive the point home as far as what we can do with Massive that's different from the subtractive synthesizer. And a lot of times with the subtractive synthesizer, we want to create these very abrasive type sounds, that we wouldn't necessarily be able to do with it. And it's more of a wavetable type of thing in a lot of the modern electronic music styles. So, you can absolutely spend, as much time as you want trying to make Sylenth sound like, this big bass synthesizer that you'll hear inside, a dubstep or an electro tune. But it's a paint on the palette that's going to fit a place. And where it fits the place is for this warm, rounded type of thing or this lush type of sound. Whereas Massive, is going to be able to do these very, very big, heavy abrasive sounds and everything. I actually didn't like Massive when it came out, believe it or not, because it didn't have that warm, rich kind of sound to me. And, over the years, it grew on me quite a bit and a lot of the presets really didn't do much for me when I heard it either. When I got into programming it and everything and realized just how deep the whole thing was, and I never had a PPG at my disposal. I had the Steinberg PPG plugin, the Wave plugin that they had. Yes, the presets are nothing to write home about for this. This is one of these things that you kind of have to make the sounds as you go. But as far as the interface goes here inside Massive, again, it's one of these things that, this is a synthesizer that I have no problem starting with initialized sounds every time I sit down to write a piece of music, and I'm able to design the sound within, cook it up within a minute or two to get something working, either as a placeholder or something that I'll elaborate on more with all of it. But it's very, very powerful. So, one of the things that people do like to pit this whole thing as far as Serum versus Massive, and if we're what's the point in looking at Massive if there's a newer thing, the Serum thing that does this. And I will say this, both of them are different as far as the types of sounds that you can create. I don't believe that Serum is able to create as abrasive and heavy sounds as easily as Massive is, but I think that Massive is not able to create the analog-y type things where it sounds like, it's got those elements of I guess you could do it with an instrument rack or with a container inside Bitwig or a track stack inside Logic to make combinations of these different types of engines. But again, when you're dealing with multiple plugin windows at the same time for different instruments, it starts to lose some of the gel with the sound. You have to deal with two engines separately at the same time to create these two separate things happening. And it's much better when it's all in one single place, if it can be. So, as far as the types of sounds that you can create with Massive versus Serum, they're different. And even though you can import the wavetables from Massive into Serum, you still can't make the sounds sound the same way because it doesn't have the distortions. It doesn't have the layout the same way. It does FM, inside Serum, but it does it in a different way. It doesn't do it as a dedicated oscillator for it. It does it with the sub oscillator or oscillator 2 or oscillator 1 acting as an FM source. So it's different, Will you be able to get a similar type of vibe? Sure, of course you can get a similar type of vibe when you're able to do, take a wavetable synthesizer that's able to import wavetables. So, but even without being able to import wavetables, Massive is still, at the top of my list as far as things that I would reach for as a sound programming tool. And in many respects, I do think for certain styles of music, it's easier to coax, I don't see anybody using Massive X either, except for some Native Instruments promotional videos. I have it. I have a copy of it. I've used it a little bit. They took away a bunch of my favorite things with it. And the major thing that they took away was the fact that the LFOs have multiple waveforms on them, and you cannot change things so quickly with the offset and everything. Yeah, it's half baked. It's not fully baked. So that's okay. I don't need to use it. No one's putting a gun to my head saying, you now must use Massive X. As long as they continued, and Massive is a 64-bit instrument, I would be very surprised if they decided they were going to stop supporting Massive. Although, maybe they'll make a liar out of me, but I really would be very surprised if they did. I hope that they don't, but, maybe they would. Thank you, everybody. Have a great week.